Hello, good morning. This is Ashley Owens here to do my midterm presentation. My midterm presentation is entitled Student Performance in Exams, an Exercise in Data Cleaning, Presentation, and Excel Operation. So for our introduction here, I've explained the midterm assignment and tasks completed to this point. Of course, you already know all this, so I won't go through everything, but I would like to point out the data cleaning step was definitely performed multiple times, primarily at the beginning, but there were adjustments made all the way through, as were goals also were adjusted and made throughout the process. My data set, the source was a little difficult to pin down. It's a list of 1,000 high school student exam scores, and you can see there on the right the original 8 columns that comprise the original values. The only information I could find about the source was that it was collected by SP scientist from India, but it was described as marks secured by students in high school from the United States. So I'm not exactly sure what school this could be from. This is the original data I received, so that is how it looked beforehand. And this is my completed data dictionary. So the original 8 columns you saw are listed here, and then anything I added. Again, I won't read this all for you, but to point out a few things. First of all, the parental education level, whichever parent attained the highest education, that's what we went with for the data. Lunch status, if you're not aware, is where you can apply as a parent, and if you qualify economically, your student can receive free or reduced lunch prices. Standard would indicate that either you didn't apply or you didn't qualify. The test preparation course, which in my opinion was the most important statistic, as I imagine it is to the user, which we'll get to later, indicated whether the student enrolled in this fictional or real, I'm not sure, test preparation course that was offered before exams by the school. The birth date and age at exam are fictional data. I created that and inserted them myself, but it actually did lead to some interesting patterns, so we'll look at those later. Data cleaning, a few things to point out. I definitely added multiple columns as I added data as we went through. Some column headings were adjusted or clarified from the original data. I did some sorting and some color indicators just to make it easier to read for the user, and we'll look at the tables and other things inserted as we go. So my data analysis goals, I had multiple at the beginning here, and we'll go through them one at a time. I also combined assignment 2 goals here because I basically took 3 of the previous goals from assignment 1 and then elaborated on them with pivot tables and charts to make them easier to interact with for the user. So my first question was, does the test preparation course lead to higher scores on exams? I assumed this would probably be the number one question that the user, the school representative or the teacher would be asking, and why the data analyst even got a hold of this data. So as you can see there, test scores were actually lower on average when a student had completed the test prep course. That's the pivot table. Here's the chart. So we'll get to conclusions later on, but you can clearly see that the test prep course does not appear to help the students in any way. And this would be something the teachers would want to know. I like the pivot chart compared to the table here because it's easier for the user to immediately see the discrepancy there. The next question I asked was, does parental education level lead to higher student exam scores? There was a pattern here, but it was a little bit inconsistent. I'll go ahead and pop over to the chart so you can see the pattern more clearly. So high school was, parents who had only completed high school led to the lowest student exam scores, but bachelor's degree actually dropped lower than associates as well. There was a little dip there, so that's kind of interesting to note. And I think the user would want to be aware of this general question because if they know the population surrounding their school and the trend of parental education levels, with this chart, they may be able to decide what type of outreach programs or participation they want to involve with the parents to kind of assist the student scores as well. The next question I addressed was, does lunch status or program affect the scores? And as you can see here, it was just a 1-point difference. Standard lunch students did make higher scores as depicted by the pivot chart. It's such a close score that I don't know that I would be able to draw any conclusions from it, but we still go ahead and present that to the user. Then beyond the questions, I wanted to be able to program into the Excel sheet a couple functions for the teacher or school representative that I thought they would find useful. So first, I wanted to be able to quickly locate the specific grade ranges on the exam. So for this, I used the match function that we learned and generated this table, and it has two different uses. The first one is, as you can see, it will list the row where those letter grades begin for each subject. That's handy for the teachers to go scrolling through the data and find. But what I really like about this table is it gives you an immediate summary of how students did. You can see that the lower scores for math start earlier in the rows than reading and writing, which indicates that the students did actually worse on the math than the other two exams. I also wanted the teachers to be able to see the student's exam grade as a letter grade immediately. Most schools have some sort of report card system where that would be a handy feature. So I used the VLOOKUP function of Excel and utilized the table that you see there on the left to generate the information. And what I decided to do on the Excel sheet was make a separate sheet just for my formulas here, the one we just looked at, it's in the top left. That way, when the teachers are looking at the data, they don't have a random table with more numbers that's confusing to them. Next, I wanted to determine quickly if an exam was passed. That way teachers could rank the tests by that quickly and organize them as well. So similar thing here, just using HLOOKUP this time, and you can see the pattern. So finally, I wanted to be able to dive deeper into the potential implications of the data, but the original data set really didn't provide me with what I needed to do that. It was just lists of numbers with no real connections that would be of use. So for the final portion, I went ahead and used an online randomizer to just assign birth dates straight down the row of 1,000 scores. Obviously, I chose age ranges that would make sense to be in high school at the time. And then I used the dated if function to take the randomly assigned birth dates, compare it to the testing date, which I went ahead and made as May 1st, 2019, and then use that function to generate actual ages. So this section will be fictional, but I did want to run through it quickly because I thought it showed an interesting pattern. So the first question I asked was, what is the impact of student age on score average? Again, this is fictional, but if we pretend it's real, what was interesting here was the 14-year-olds got the lowest score, typically freshmen. That's not shocking. Their first year in high school, still learning what's expected of them and how to perform on exams. But what would be of interest, I think, to the user, to the school, is that the exam scores spike in 16-year-olds, typically juniors, and they drop back down in seniors. So that would want to be something the school would look at, maybe motivation-based or curriculum-based. So that pattern was interesting. So the next I thought, well, if freshmen got the lowest scores and students who completed the test prep course got the lower scores, I wonder if there was a majority of freshmen taking the test prep course, because then perhaps the school could conclude that maybe it's not just the test prep course, maybe it's who's taking it as well. But again, these were randomly entered, so we don't know if it's true, but it proved my hypothesis incorrect, as the 15 and 16-year-olds actually made up the majority of course participants, and they got the highest scores on the exams. So finally, I wanted to use the data analysis function to give something useful to the school. I did it just here on the math exam, but you could easily replicate this on reading and writing as well. So I made my bins every 10 because I really wanted to break down and stretch out the students so the teachers could see where their students fall. As you can see, the majority of students actually fell in the 70 and 80 bins. So the majority of students did pass the exam, which is great news. Then the remaining majority, if we take the majority of that, fell in the 50 and 60 range. They were close to passing. It's pretty encouraging. We'll talk about that more in the recommendation section. So here are my conclusions. Won't read all that to you, but just to point out the few I think are most important to the user. It would be the test prep course does not lead to higher exam scores, and the majority of students passed or were close to passing the math exam. So it's something we could look into. If the fictional data was true, I would also alert them that 16-year-olds got the highest exam scores and maybe need to look into that a little bit and see why. So for my recommendations to the school, I would recommend that they cease the current test prep course as it is. It seems to be a waste of resources and time. You could definitely adjust it and do more testing to see why it's not achieving its goal. And then if the ages were accurate and true, I would recommend that they look into why the 16-year-olds are getting the highest scores and see if they can apply the teaching methods used in that grade to the other grades as well. My final recommendation would be, as I pointed out, there were numerous students right in that 60 to 50 bin, and they were close to passing. So I would encourage the school to really evaluate the test, see if the questions are clear, see how the questions and subjects are being taught in the classroom versus presented on the test. we don't know how many questions were on this exam. These students in the 50 and 60 range may have only missed 3 or 4 questions. And if we can get them to understand those questions, we would have a lot more students passing. So that was my presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day.